Um, so this week we're in Parshat Vayera, and I recommend you come tomorrow because Simon's going to take us deep into theological thinking about the Parsha. But tonight I wanted to talk a little bit about the conversation that Moshe and God have at the burning bush when God introduces God's self to Moshe with a new name. And God says to Moses, I knew you, I knew your ancestors. Your ancestors knew me, God says to Moses. Your ancestors knew me as El Shaddai. But I am also known by the name Yud-He Vav-He, which is a name we don't pronounce. And earlier this week, with our weekly Parsha group, we were studying one of the Hasidic texts about this, and they were asking why God didn't want to use God's actual name, Yud-He Vav-He, with our ancestors. Why did God use a different name? And the Hasidim talk about how there are many ways in which God keeps us at a distance, but for our own sake. And the Hasidim talk about, they lean on the tradition that they've built upon, which is the Kabbalistic tradition, and they talk about the Kabbalistic understanding of the creation of the world and how God retracted into God's self to make space for creation, and that there are ways in which God continues to be in some ways restricted from us or distilled, partly just so that we can exist without being overwhelmed, so that there's space for us, but also because even too much of God can be a negative thing. We need balance. We need protection from getting too deep into our spirituality. That can be a good thing until it kind of tips over into a less good thing. And the Hasidim knew that, especially because they were very focused on devotion. And everything that they did was for the service of God. And so they saw in their own communities that sometimes people could go too far, could take it too far. And we see in our own world ways in which people take religion and their beliefs too far. And so that's how the Hasidim understood this need for distance, a little bit of distance from God, that God has different ways of limiting our relationship with God, or our proximity to God, or our knowledge of God. And so they say that by giving us, by giving the patriarchs and the matriarchs a different name, not Yud-He Vav-He, God was sort of keeping them a little bit at a distance compared to Moshe, who we know God brings close in a more intimate way than with anybody else, that Moses knows God more than most human beings get to know God. And so God gives Moshe God's true name. But so there's this idea from the Hasidim. So we're going to set that aside for a second. And then it struck me as interesting also because the other thing that I've been thinking about in relation to this, which I apologize, Diana's heard this part already, but there's also this idea of perspective and seeing one thing in many different ways. That there's one God, but we have many different names for God, and different people who experience God in different ways might gravitate towards different names for God or might relate better to different names for God. And there are ways in which we shy away from difference and conflict, that we're often uncomfortable with differences of opinion or perspective. And just like God is in some ways has distance from us, we often want to distance ourselves from conflict, from differences, from different perspectives. It's not always easy to confront. And I noticed especially sort of how shocking it can be sometimes when we realize how we are looking at one thing in one way and someone else is looking at it in such a different way. And anyone who listened to the trial in The Hague this week, yesterday and today, were very different portrayals of seemingly the same thing, but called really different things and understood really different ways. And it can be really uncomfortable to live in a world and be aware that there are other people who see it so differently than we do. It's upsetting. And I found this week a little bit of comfort in this idea that God is saying to Moses, you see me one way, and our ancestors saw me a different way, and future generations are going to see me a different way. And that's okay. That's how we're created. We're created with difference. We experience differently, we perceive differently, we relate differently, we understand differently. And even though sometimes that's uncomfortable, if God is saying to Moshe that it's okay for God to be known by different names and to be experienced in different ways, we have to also confront the possibility that difference can be good, even when it's uncomfortable. And that we have to learn how to navigate those differences. We have to learn how to live in a world where we don't all see things the same way, rather than trying to force one perspective on another. God doesn't say to Moshe, you must, only have one name for God. God says it's okay for there to be more than one name. It's okay for there to be more than one way of experiencing the world, but we've got to figure out how to get along in a world where we don't all experience things the same way. And when I sort of think about that, and I think about the Hasidic texts about God protecting us from God's self, I think there's sort of something about that balance where too much conflict too much of something, too much of anything can be dangerous for us. And we still need a little bit of difference. We still need to be able to navigate a world where we don't all see things the same way. And to find that sort of tricky space in the middle of those two places is part of our challenge and our invitation in life, in the times that we're living through, and in the Parsha this week. So I invite you to try to find that space for yourself, to maybe find someone that you see things differently than, and sit down and talk about it. Try to understand one another. Not to convince, but just to open to a different way. Even if it's just to ask them, what name do you use for God and why? Shabbat Shalom. We'll take a minute for healing. Thinking of those in need of healing of body, mind, or spirit. Mishaberach is on page 370.